Hi, this videocast is to explain the Australian Core Skills Framework, more so in its structure than its detailed content. I'm going to expect that you are going to have a look through this document and become familiar with the concepts of the core skills, the 5 levels of the core skills, the performance indicators, and the domains of communication. But having said that, I'm going to show you some tips on how to use this document to effectively identify the core skill requirements of our training, meaning the industry, the expectations of the units of competency, looking at how we can identify the core skills of our learners, and then how we can also identify the core skills of our expectations of our students in general in relation to enrolment, training and assessment. So firstly, we're going to have a look at the contents page, which explains how the core skills are broken down in this framework. You have the core skills of learning, reading, writing, oral communication, and numeracy. And they're broken down into the 5 levels of the core skills framework. Now, these 5 levels of the core skills framework can be best explained on this page 7 of the core skills framework, which identifies the performance variables grid. And again, each of the core skills are broken down into the 5 levels, and these 5 levels are also broken down into the concepts of support, context, text complexity, and task complexity. And each level is increasingly more complex in regards to those concepts. So, for example, in text complexity, at level 1, short, simple, highly explicit texts. Level 2, simple, familiar texts with a clear purpose. Level 3, routine texts. Level 4, complex texts. Level 5, highly complex texts. So the 5 levels are basically that. Level 1 is basic, very simple. Level 2, simple, starting to become familiar. Level 3 is familiar routine activity. Level 4 is complex activity. Level 5 is highly complex activity. So then when we start to look at the rest of the structure of the document, it breaks the concepts of the core skills down again into different indicators. These indicators are simply more specific activities that they would do within those core skills. For example, oral communication is broken down into speaking and listening. Maths is broken down into identifying mathematical information, using mathematical information, and communicating with mathematical information. So what this framework is basically doing is taking the 5 core skills and breaking them down into their most simple, observable tasks. Simple not meaning the complexity of the levels, but the detail is in there at the different levels so that you can quite easily pinpoint the levels or the expectations of your training, the levels of your learners as they enter into your training, and then once we have that comparison, we can design and develop strategies to help them build the core skills in the training to the level that they need to be assessed as competent. Each of the core skills, as I said, is broken down into quite detailed descriptions. So as I'm flicking through, you can see we're at level 1 in the concept of learning. The learning is the yellow section. Learning level 1, indicator 1, broken down into support, context, text complexity, task complexity. It's also broken down into focus areas, learner identity, goals and pathways, planning and organising. It's then broken down into some of the performance features that could be seen in those particular focus areas. Indicator 2, again, same concepts across the top here, but broken down into different focus areas and different performance features. It then gives you some examples of activities that they could do in their personal life, in their workplace and employment, or in training in relation to learning level 1. So again, a very detailed, dense document that gives you a lot of information about the different core skills, the different levels, and the different performances or performance variables that they would be demonstrating at that level in that core skill. I'm going to take you to Appendix 1 in the back of the book. Appendix 1 summarises all of this information in these tables. Appendix 1A is Learning Indicator number 1, and you can see that they have the 5 levels across the top, and they have the focus areas down the left-hand side. And they've got those descriptors of the performance variables in each level, in each focus area. And hopefully what you'll see as you read across each of these focus areas, the increasing complexity in those particular concepts. And you'll start to identify key words in those different levels, in those different focus areas that will help you again pinpoint what level your learner is at or what level the unit of competency or the industry is expecting them to be at in that particular core skill. You will end up with familiar focus areas, ones that you see or expect to see in your different units of competency, and you'll end up identifying those key words that will help you peg your learner or peg your unit of competency. I'm going to have a look at the concept of reading to explain this in more detail. So when we have the reading, audience purpose and mean making indicator, we have the focus area of complexity. So at level 1, they can understand a limited range of short, highly explicit, accessible texts. Level 2, they can understand the main ideas in at least 2 types of short, unambiguous texts. Level 3, they can understand familiar texts of limited complexity that may incorporate graphs, tables, and charts. Level 4, complex syntactic structures that may incorporate some technical specificity and information presented in graphic, diagrammatic, and visual form. And Level 5, highly complex, lexically dense texts. So let's put that into a workplace context. What sort of documents are your students expected to read on the job on a daily basis or on a regular basis? Are they familiar texts with limited complexity, but they may have graphs, tables, charts to help people navigate through? Are they complex syntactic structures with technically specific information? Or are they quite highly complex, lexically dense, lots of information, complex sentences, lots of details? If your students are reading familiar, everyday documents, forms, policies and procedures that are limited in their complexity, everyday language, then they would be considered level 3 documents and a level 3 expectation of your learner. Are they documents such as manufacturers' specifications or legislation that might have some complex structures and technically specific language in there that they're going to have to learn and understand? Yes, of course, over time they will become familiar documents, but when you're looking at them for the first time, are they technically specific? So then you would have to judge whether the documents that they're expected to learn are level 3 or whether they're level 4. If we have a look at the concept of writing, specifically in the concepts of vocabulary, grammar, punctuation, spelling, again, can they use basic punctuation? Can they use punctuation as an aid for understanding? Can they use punctuation accurately and effectively? Can they use all features of punctuation, font, and layout effectively? So this is where you're seeing the complexity increase between the different levels. What writing tasks are your learners expected to do on the job? Actually comes back in the indicator before. But when we look at the mechanics of writing, are they expected to use spell checker to increase the understanding independence of their spelling? And do they spell with reasonable accuracy? Are they expected to spell with reasonable accuracy? or that are they expected to use a range of spelling strategies and get it relatively right all of the time. So use these tables in the appendix at the back of the book to start to understand the concepts of the core skills, the focus areas. Find those ones that you need to become familiar with that are explicit in your units of competency, the expectations of the industry, and come back and plot your levels of your units of competency. When we're looking at the industry expectations, we always look at the highest expectation. So, for example, if your unit of competency expects people to use complex sentences and write detailed reports, I would be expecting them to be at level 4 to 5. If even though some of the concepts might be they can make occasional mistakes with spelling, or that they use the spell checker, sorry, not the punctuation. But if they're expected to use complex sentences, then that makes the whole unit level 4 in writing. If it expects them, for example, in the mathematical concepts, we'll go over to maths, numeracy, and we're looking at the complexity of maths, and the difference for me between level 3 and level 4 is the concepts of formula and algebraic equations. If any of the numeracy in your unit of competency requires them to do formula or algebraic equations, then it's a level 4 in that unit of competency. Even though the majority of the concepts might be just about whole numbers, dates and times, and familiar 2D, 3D shapes, if there's anything in there about formula or algebra, then it automatically becomes a level 4 requirement for that unit of competency. When we're looking at our students, we go on the lowest level that they are demonstrating within that particular concept. So if in this concept of numeracy, they don't understand the concept of digital times, they struggle with maybe formulas, not so much, sorry, not formulas, but volume, capacity, or temperature measures. If they have some gaps here, even though they might be able to do some of the other concepts here, then it means that they're a level 2 and they need assistance in those specific concepts to then get to the level 3. So I'm hoping I haven't confused you with those last concepts of the learner and the training, but the key thing is to identify what the levels are of your learner, find out what skills they have using LLN indicator tools that are available, and then find out what the expectations of your unit of competency are by again identifying the key concepts that they need to do within those units of competency from these appendices in the back of the Australian Core Skills Framework. And that way we can compare the levels of our learners to the levels of the expectations of the unit. We also need to understand what are we expecting of them generally in our enrolment processes, in our training strategies, and in our assessment expectations. And that's where we're going to come up with a three-way comparison to help us build the strategies to support our learners. So again, if we have quite complex numerical concepts that they have to perform in their enrolment process, then it makes the enrolment process quite complex, whereas the training itself may not have that expectation. So anyway, have a look through the appendices, become familiar with the focus areas, become familiar with the levels, find those keywords for yourself to identify the differences. And in the next video cast, we'll look at how we're going to use that information.